Welcome to my Florida tourism presentation. We're going to be discussing the pros and cons of tourism on Florida. This is demonstrated by myself, Cristela Martinez. And before we get started, we're going to define tourism by its common definition: the travel for pleasure and business. So what is the reason why we come here? As you can see listed above, almost more than half of the list is ocean-based. So most tourists come to Florida because of our oceans, and that's not surprising because most of the state is surrounded by three large bodies of waters. So let's discuss the pros of Florida. So the pros of Florida is, of course, the economic growth, and two areas show large amounts of economic growth, thus being the Florida Keys as well as Walt Disney World. And in the Florida Keys, we can see that back during the 2005 era, there is a increase from 2005 to 2007, a 22% in tourist spending. And it's a domino effect. So because the tourists spend more money, means that the local economy also relies on that money to then give more jobs. And thus the reasoning for our data shown up here. And this can be same aspect for Walt Disney World as well. In fact, the second largest university is in Orlando. And it correlates because Walt Disney World works with those with graphic designer majors to create more jobs, and thus those jobs stay within Orlando, thus giving a rise to Orlando's success as a whole. So we're going to be discussing now the cons, and the cons, of course, is crime. There's always that stereotype when dealing with the spring break mentality. But unfortunately, every stereotype has its truths. Yes, when it comes to human trafficking, as tourist numbers go up, there is more of a demand for sex workers. But also realize that because Florida is the most southern part of America and the most northern part of Central America, we can see that it is the key aspect of shifting those who are in human trafficking, both in labor human trafficking as well as sexual human trafficking, from the North America to the Europe to Central America to even South America. It's basically the stopping point. And this is the same thing for drug trafficking. Again, with the stereotype of the spring break mentality. And so we can see correlations from music festivals to overdoses, or from really big events to overdoses in hospitals. And because of this, we can also see property damages in Airbnbs and hotels due to those people who unfortunately have abused alcohol or drugs. So we're going to then discuss ecological disturbances. So an example would be the harassment of native species, specifically manatees, in our local Fort Myers area. In Fort Myers, there is a park called Manatee Park, and it is known to be Manatee Park because the government discharges warm water into the river streams, and that attracts the manatees due to the cooling of the ocean into more inland. And this is the issue because most of the manatees get harassed by the tourists, even though the tourists are told not to. Harassment dealing that they touch them, and they often try to ride them. And this is an issue because it drives the manatees back into the colder water, that thus has a cold water syndrome that will result into the manatees often expiring. And so, besides that, there's also land encroachment, and the reason why is because there needs to be structural support for the abundance of people coming into Florida in such a short amount of time. Thus, this structural support means that development into native lands, such as the Everglades, will be, unfortunately, to such a damaging restraint that we can see endangerment in animals and in plants. Examples would be gopher tortoises as well as the bald eagle. Plant examples would be different types of orchids that are native to Florida. And this is The reason why there's also endangerment is because of invasive species. Fruit flies came here because of agricultural imports of different fruits and cost the Department of Agriculture a hefty amount of money. Same thing with screwworms. Screwworms infected the native population of the key deer. And we can see that termites have done a lot of structural damage because of the imports of different types of mulches from China. We can see that snails, for example, when trying to get rid of these types of invasive species, it costs almost 15 million just to get rid of a snail. We can see that for termites, it had costed them 2 million just to get rid of the issues with the key deer. And so this is just rookie numbers compared to the amount of money that costed Florida when discussing bacterial diseases that were caused by insects. Basically, insects were the hosts that carried them over. And it ruined the citrus industry and is right now plaguing the avocado industry. Going back there, we can see that there is climate change impacts. Climate change impacts being that Miami, for example, is built mostly on limestone, and limestone is porous. So people often say that the solution to sea level rise is to build a seawall, but unfortunately the water will seep under the seawall through the limestone and just come above it. So issues that we can see that in is also in Fort Lauderdale. And not only is sea level rise an issue, but also because of warmer ocean is another issue. Warming of the ocean, it causes more impactful hurricanes. For example, if for the past 5 years we always had a major hurricane. Another example is that red tide, Dinoflagella, the bacteria prospers in warm oceans, so the discharges rather than being 3 days will be 6 months. And red tide is an issue because it infects the fishing industry in Florida in the way that it takes oxygen out of the water and thus drowning the fish. And of course, warming oceans correlate to coral reef destruction that will also drive down the needed tourism that certain areas like Key West needs. So then we have the pollution impact. So, for example, fertilizers feed the red tide, and fertilizers are often done by industries like the sugarcane industries or by those owning hotels or those owning residents here, spraying fertilizers onto their lawn. And then again, we also have plastic. Plastic is such a big issue to a point that it just filters around the Atlantic, a big island in the Pacific, and often in the Gulf. We still have impacts of oil into the Gulf that has just seeped down. Those microplastics will get into the food and thus get into us, and it also is correlating to some cancer risks due to that. And of course, all of this pollution impact does impact the Everglades. We can see that the decretion of the Everglades size is not only due to the encroachment of land, but it's also due to the fact that when it comes to pollution, like for example, Lake Okeechobee's discharges, the Everglades should have the discharges come down slowly rather than discharging onto the left and right side of Florida. And we can see that Everglades have a mal impact because it doesn't have that required water running through it. The Everglades is very important too because it also creates fresh water due to the wetlands. But that's concluding the presentation. Thank you so much for having me. Hope you all have a wonderful day.